Fear and I spent a good couple of minutes sneaking down numerous hallways once we got the armored door open. We were in the prison cell block. I anxiously and rather impatiently slammed each cell door open, only to be disappointed by the lack of occupants. With Fear's help, we divided the side of the walls, and the task went by faster. I was immensely disappointed when we reached the end of the hallway, with still no sign of Rachel. "Where is she?" I asked frantically.
"I don't know, John,"
Fear replied.
"She should be close by. Maybe they're keeping her in an interrogation room?"
That news gave me a new sliver of hope as I nodded in agreement. Suddenly, the echo of barely muted footsteps reached us, and we tensed up in anticipation. To my relief, the medic's figure quickly made its way towards us.
"Where the hell have you two been?"
He started once he reached us. He glanced at both of us, and a questioning look appeared on his face.
"Where's Agent Claire?"
I glanced at Fear and saw that he, too, was looking at me. I gave him a sympathetic look before I turned to face Agent Darrow. She was a phantom agent. She didn't leave us any choice. I answered as I slightly bent my head down. The older man's eyes widened slightly as he understood my meaning. He sighed tiredly as he paced around.
"Agent Kian is not going to be happy,"
he commented. "He'll have to understand," I said. Agent Darrow stopped in his tracks and turned to face me.
"Easier said than done, kid. Who's going to tell him that his only niece was a traitor to our organization?"
Fear stepped forward.
"We won't tell him the truth. We'll say that she gave up her life for us to complete the mission."
Both Agent Darrow and I looked at him in disbelief as he stared back blankly. "Fear," I started, "you don't have to do this. You don't owe her anything."
"I'm not asking for your permission, John,"
he replied.
"I was aware of Agent Claire's feelings for me. Despite her betrayal, she still had a good heart. I owe that to her, at least."
I was about to retort when each of our earpieces abruptly beeped simultaneously. Curious, I activated it. A muffled voice came through.
"Hello there, Seeker Agents,"
it said excitedly.
"I'm so glad you answered my call. No one likes being ignored."
The voice then snickered. In the background, there were noises that sounded like there was a struggle.
"So sorry about that. My guest is not at all well-mannered." "Oh yeah? Screw you!"
Came the second voice. I recognized it as Gizmo's.
"Yikes! No need to be sassy, lad. I'm going to have to teach you some manners,"
the first voice replied. For a moment there was silence before the voice returned.
"I've got a question for you, Seeker Agents. What do you reckon will happen if I place an active grenade in his hand?"
At first there was nothing, but then Gizmo's agonizing screams echoed like thunder through the pager's speakers.
Ah!
I winced at the intensity of his reaction.
"Oh, what do you know? His whole bloody hand explodes! Get it? Bloody!"
The dominant voice laughed. I narrowed my eyes in fury, but the voice resumed speaking before I could have taken any course of action.
"All right, I've had my fun. Now it's time to get to business. I know all about your little rescue operation, so I'll make you a deal. Surrender yourselves over to the Phantoms, and Agent Moore will be given back unharmed. However, if you fail to cooperate, we will not hesitate to kill her. You've got 30 minutes.
With that, the connection was cut. I looked up at Fear and Agent Darrow. Both had a serious look on their faces as they reflected over the demand. Alas, Fear spoke.
"John, there's no way we're doing what he said."
I stared at Fear in confusion. "What are you talking about? That's the only way to get Rachel back." Fear shook his head.
"What if it's a trap to kill us all in one spot? We have to assess the situation before we make a move."
"I agree,"
Agent Darrow added in.
We can't make a move until Pete and the rest of his team draw the attention of the bulk of the Phantom forces. Once we have a safe passage, then we'll focus on getting Agent Moore.
I stubbornly refused their answers. You too heard what the voice said. If we don't surrender ourselves soon, they will kill Rachel. Fear placed his hands on my shoulders and shook me.
Get a hold of yourself, John. We're not suggesting to abandon the mission. We just need a better alternative.
I stared at Fear wide-eyed before I willed myself to snap out of my slight hysteria. I nodded my head in agreement. Fear appeared satisfied, for he removed his hands from my shoulders and leaned back. So what's the plan? I asked. It was Agent Arrow who answered.
We've got to lay low until Pete and the rest of the distraction team do their job. When that's done, we'll eliminate Agent Moore's captors and free her. Then, it's hasta la vista from here.
Fear nodded in approval.
I like it. It'll give us a chance to get back at the bastards.
I nodded as well as I didn't feel like talking. My only thoughts revolved around Rachel. With a mutual agreement, Agent Arrow activated his earpiece.
Pete, are you there?
I'm here.
He replied.
What is your position?
We're in the cell block. There is no sign of Agent Moore, however. There is a chance that the Phantoms are using her as bait in order to lure us out.
I see.
Pete said.
What do you need from me?
Just do your job well, Pete. Also, tell Agent Kian to hurry up with his support. It should be clear for them since Agent Evans completed his task.
Understood. We'll draw their fire from you. Good luck.
You too.
Agent Arrow replied before he ended the connection. He looked at Fear and I carefully.
Alright, this is it. Pete will draw their attention and will head up to the interrogation rooms. Hopefully, there won't be too many Phantom agents for us to take out.
Both Fear and I nodded, and with the conclusion of our brainstorming, we hurriedly made our way up through the layers of HQ's underground section. As we arrived on the interrogation level, Agent Arrow's earpiece hummed to life, and the medic activated it.
Agent Arrow here.
It's Pete. Agent Science Support just arrived. We compromised one of the Phantom delivery trucks, and now the entire base is on alert. We should be cleared of any resistance down below.
An explosion cut off Pete's voice as he grunted.
We'll try to keep them focused on us as long as we can, but we will pull out when it becomes too much. Just don't take too long.
Numerous gunshots boomed in the connection.
Understood, Pete. Arrow out.
He looked up at us.
We better hurry,
he said. Without a second thought, we quickly but carefully proceeded through the interrogation level. We briefly looked through each door until we reached the end of the hallway that led to an open area. Up ahead was a lone, hooded figure with its back towards us. All three of us cautiously walked over until we were at the opening of the hall.
Secret agents! Glad to see that you've listened to my message.
The figure then turned around to face us. Where is Agent Moore? I asked as calmly as I could. The figure appeared uninterested, for he shifted his weight onto one hip and crossed his arms.
She took her own life.
He said plainly.
Cyanide pill?
My eyes widened in shock as the horrifying news slapped me across the face. No, I finally managed to say. You're lying. The man raised an eyebrow in a mocking manner.
Am I? Agent Moore was so devastated to find out that the man she loved was the son of the man responsible for the death of her family.
My heart skipped a beat, and the blood in my veins turned to ice. Either the Phantom agent was blind or didn't care, but he laughed nonetheless.
So shocking, isn't it? And who better to tell her that than the one person who is more like you than even you know?
As he spoke, the Phantom agent proceeded to remove his mask, and with one last look at me, he took off his hood. Instinctively, I stepped back as I was literally taken by surprise. It was like looking at my own reflection, although he had a distinguishable scar over his nose. His eyes, my deformed eyes, stared back at me with amusement, yet with a hint of hatred as well. I barely heard the sharp breath escape from Agent Darrow, nor did I notice the disturbed look that Fear gave me. My look-alike laughed briefly.
Your reactions amuse me, especially yours, John.
I just stared in shock as I couldn't find my voice. I knew that my father was ruthless in his ambitions, but I never suspected that he used me to make this abomination. How? I finally managed to voice. My clone shrugged carelessly.
You're his son. I imagine it must have been easy to get a sample of your DNA. The rest of the details are too scientific for me to care about.
My entire body went slack, and it felt like I was paralyzed. Rachel was dead? No, that couldn't have been true. He was lying. What do you want? I asked after a few tense moments in silence. The Phantom Agent cocked his head.
Are you stupid? I thought you'd understand by now. You're coming with me.
Fear automatically stepped forward.
That's not going to happen,
he said.
Not you, idiots. Just him.
The Phantom replied as he pointed at me.
Come on, Johnny. Daddy wants to see his little boy again.
My clone snickered. I narrowed my eyes at my look-alike, and we just stared at each other intensely. I analyzed all of his details that were exactly like mine, from the color of our hair to the streak that came across his face when he frowned. I figured that he did the same thing to me. Alas, I spoke. If my father wants me to join his side, he'll just toss you aside like garbage. Don't you realize that?
Of course I do. Do you really think I'm blind to his goals?
My clone shook his head.
No, I have much greater plans for the Phantoms. However, in order for them to work, I need to get rid of you.
Before I could have reacted, the Phantom Agent swiftly brought a shotgun and fired straight at me. For a moment, the entire world went into slow motion. 1 minute, the Phantom Agent was in my sights. The next, another figure was in front of me and then fell down. As it collapsed to the ground, I finally snapped out of my haze and looked down in horror. Fear! I cried out. I dropped to my knees and gently brought Fear's head into my lap. He grunted in pain and coughed out a rather large pulp of blood. My eyes widened at the amount of blood he was losing, and I desperately applied pressure to the wound. I then looked up at the bastard of my clone and glared at him fiercely. You son of a bitch. You'll pay for this! Do you hear me? You'll pay for this! The freak of nature merely snorted.
Promises, promises,
he replied. Abruptly, an explosion rattled the area. Pieces of the wall flew at us, and I immediately covered Fear's face with my body. When the rumbling stopped, I looked back up and saw my clone roll his hands into fists as his glowing eyes flared up even more.
We'll continue this later.
He growled before he disappeared into the darkness. I looked up at the area where he used to be, before another terrible cough from Fear brought my attention back to him. Desperate, I looked up at Agent Darrow. He needs medical attention, I stated. The older man looked at me sadly.
Indeed he does, but that is something we don't have here.
I narrowed my eyes at the older man. We can't just leave him down here. He'll die.
He'll die either way, whether we take him with us or not. His wound is too severe to treat here, and he already lost too much blood to move properly. I'm sorry, but there's no hope for him.
I looked at the man in disbelief before I snarled at him. I'm not leaving him behind! Suddenly a hand grabbed my arm and pulled me slightly down. I looked in surprise. Fear looked back at me in desperation.
He's right, John. There's nothing you can do for me.
He shivered violently, and my heartbeat escalated. Fear slowly regained his composure and looked at me once more.
Take care of my sisters, and make sure you beat the phantoms. Otherwise, I'll come back from the grave and kick your ass.
He then coughed harshly as more blood spurted from his mouth. Right away, I held his head up higher to prevent him from choking on his blood. To my surprise, Fear did something I never thought I'd see him do. The first time ever since I've known him, my friend cried. Not just one tear, with thick wet streaks that went down both of his cheeks. I froze as I had no idea what to do.
They were wrong.
He finally whispered.
There's absolutely nothing.
And just like that, I lost my best friend. At first I remained frozen, for I refused to accept what had happened. His normally clear blue eyes were dull from the lack of life and energy. I barely registered the fact that my body was shaking uncontrollably. I winced violently as Agent Darrow placed a hand on my shoulder. I looked at the man's rare green eyes that portrayed his sympathy. I stared at them blankly, before I looked back at the body in my lap that was rapidly getting colder.
We have to go.
Agent Darrow said gently. Without a word, I tenderly rolled Fear's eyelids over his eyes and placed his head carefully on the ground. To allow his body to have some form of dignity, I took out one of his swords and placed it in his slack hands before I positioned his hands in the same posture as that of a dead king. I leaned my head down slightly as I took one last look at my friend. "Rest in peace," I whispered. Once I paid my respect, I got up and nodded at Agent Darrow for us to move on. The medic led his way to the back area, where there were boxes that spewed out tons of paper. I looked at the scene in confusion. How will we reach the main level? The armored elevator is slow, not to mention that it has a camera right in front, which can easily alert the phantoms. Agent Darrow nodded his head in agreement.
Indeed.
He replied.
Which is exactly why we're taking the service elevator. It was only used for transporting materials. Hopefully, the phantoms won't suspect us to use them.
Not at all in the mood to argue, I helped the medic open the metal door and stepped inside. The elevator's power was cut. However, Agent Darrow brought out the same device that he used underwater and gave the circuit an electrical charge. The machinery came to life, and we took the one functioning service elevator back to the surface. The ride was relatively quick, and all too soon the door opened. We were met by the sight of smoke, debris, and bodies. Some of those phantom agents, others of seeker agents. Cautiously, Agent Darrow and I got out of the elevator that was located behind the main lobby area of HQ. Out of respect, we stepped over the bodies that were sprawled over the floor, all the while keeping an eye out for any enemies. So far, the coast was clear. As such, Agent Darrow activated his earpiece once more.
Pete, my team and I are at the back. Meet us at my location.
Roger that. Scion's air drones have managed to create substantial damage before they were shot out of the sky. Hum!
He then grunted as an explosion was heard in the background. He breathed harshly.
Scion and I are the only survivors of our team. We'll meet up with you soon. Pete out.
Came the curt reply. As always, Agent Darrow and I carefully made our way outside of the building and hid behind the walls that provided some cover. Not long afterwards, Pete ran over to us. His eyes widened as he took in all the blood I was covered in.
Where's the rest of your team?
The head warrior asked. My throat tightened up on the indirect mention of my dead friend. I self-consciously swallowed and answered. Agent Fear died protecting me. As for Rachel, there's only a rumor that she's dead as well, I said quietly. Pete gave me a sympathetic look.
I am so sorry for both of them,
he replied softly.
We'll make sure that their deaths won't be in vain.
The Irish warrior then came forward.
What about my niece?
He asked roughly. I looked down and clenched my fists together. I knew that if I told him the truth of Agent Claire, then he'd go mad. So I opted to take Fear's suggestion. The Phantoms killed her too, I replied quietly. For a moment there was a tense silence as the information was taken in, before the Irish brute yelled out in anger and punched the nearest wall, which created a deep indent.
No!
I got the feeling that I was being watched, so I turned to my side and saw Agent Arrow look at me in relief. I simply nodded before I focused my attention on Pete. "What do we do?" I asked. It wasn't Pete who answered my question, as we all turned to face Agent Kean.
We kill every single one of those phantom bastards!
The Irishman then turned to face us. His hawk-like eyes flashed with a barely contained fury.
They just made this personal!
He growled ferociously.